theory, performance, rhythm, harmony, line and form, acoustics, notation, orchestration, timbre, neurology, and perception. These are the keys to understanding music.
Hello, and welcome to Understanding Music. Western notation began while Western music was still pretty much in its infancy. And to understand not only how, but the whys of why notation works the way it does, I believe demands a little bit of an understanding of that whole process, so that's what we're going to look at today. Western notation begins with plainsong, or chant, sometimes known as Gregorian chant. Chant was an ever-weaving melody with few repeats, what we would now call strictly diatonic, that followed some kind of mode. Although at the time they didn't understand the concept of modes. The way they wrote their chants in those days is they used little four-note groups of notes called tetrachords. Tetra is Latin for four, chords means notes. So they had these groups of four notes that would construct these small melodies. And they would write a chant beginning with one of these tetrachords. Da, 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 da. And if they needed to go higher or lower, they would take another one of these tetrachords and step up, da, and then from there you have another da, 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 set of four notes that you could fit together and make some kind of melody with. And then when they're coming down the other way, they sometimes would change it. And every once in a while, a note would have to go up or down, and they eventually came up with the concept of a flat and a sharp. That would put a flat would put a note down, and the sharp would put a note up. And that only ever happened on what we now know as two notes. The note B is the only one they ever flatted, and the note F is the only one they ever sharpened. Around the end of the 8th and beginning of the 9th century, people started experimenting with different ways to write music. And what came out of that was neumes, pneumatic notation, which were little squiggles that were written above the notes to give you an impression of how the melody should go. Music was still handed down in an oral tradition. One person learned the piece and taught it to another person. They eventually taught it to somebody else. But these little squiggles were used as reminders of how the melody is supposed to go. They weren't note specific, so you couldn't exactly interpret the piece unless you'd heard it. Similar to some forms of modern tab that gives you the notes and where to play them on the instrument, but unless you know the tune, you don't know what rhythms you're supposed to play in. And music progressed over the next couple of centuries. By the time Guido came around and did his study of music and wrote his book Micrologus between 1020 and 1024, he had noticed that these four-note groups, called tetrachords, actually fit into larger six-note groups we now call hexachords. And he found that there were three main hexachords. One of them, the hexachord proper, we now call the first six notes of the major scale. Ut, re, mi, fa, sol, and la. They didn't quite know what to do with that seventh note because sometimes it was flattened, sometimes it wasn't, sometimes they just jumped from la to do, and it didn't fit into the hexachord. So he explained music with hexachords. Now, by the time of Guido, pneumatic notation had started experimenting with a line. They used a line above the words, and then the little squiggles would go above it, which was more exact than just floating in space. And so he suggested using more than one line, and here's where the idea of the steps in music came out. One of the things that he discovered is that these tetrachords and now hexachords fit into a much larger spectrum of notes he called the gamut, which was every note you could think of, from the lowest note you could play up to the highest note you could play. And by extension, the lowest note that could be heard and the highest note that could be heard. And in between these two extremes, there was this progression of notes. There was always one higher, one higher, one higher, one higher. Eventually, all these concepts came together in the end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century, and we came out with the concepts of scales and modes. These seven notes are now called do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, and back to do. So those seven notes, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, is what all music from that point on revolves around. And even in modern days, Either it fits into that in some way or it doesn't fit into that. And that's the difference between diatonic music, music that does use those notes, and chromatic music, music that doesn't just revolve around those 7 notes. I think one of the big things that Guido suggested was that notation should follow the concepts of steps in music. And indeed, that's how the staff came to be. If we take a look at Guido's staff of 4 lines, if you look at an individual note, and then you go to, if it's a note on the line, and then you go to the space above it, that represents a step up to the next note. And then if you go up to the line above that, that represents a step up to that. The interesting thing is, at the time, the predominant harmony, if they were going to use a harmony at all, were 4ths and 5ths. And now that the harmonies are in 3rds, going from one note on one line to the note on the next line, or from one space to the note on the next space, easily shows the major harmony we use in music today, which is the interval of a 3rd. Now, music was predominantly sung up until about the 12th, 13th centuries, when the development of metals progressed to the point where they could make better tools, and therefore they could construct better instruments. Eventually, in the 12th to 13th century, we had little woodwind instruments like this, the beginnings of lutes, which eventually turned into our modern guitars and basses and cellos, and various other instruments. And large instruments can play very low notes, and small instruments can play very high notes, and so the range of the notes that could be used, if you were just using singers, started to expand. Also, instruments could do things that vocalists couldn't. Large jumps and fast passages of notes that only the most virtuoso singers could do, and so music started becoming a little more complicated. And the range, once the lute had been invented, the range of the lute was wider than the range of most voices. So the 4 lines turned to 5. And then eventually lutes with 6 and 7 strings came out, and so you needed even more lines. So the 5 turned into 7. And then eventually in the 13th to 14th century, keyboard instruments started evolving, and so that 7 eventually went to as many as 11. Now, when you have 11 lines, it's hard to tell which notes were which, so they would add these little descriptions. They would usually outline the 4 notes D and G and C and F on the side of the score. Over time, over the next century really, they decided to get rid of this 11 lines, and what they did is they got rid of the middle one, and that one disappeared. And now we have 2 staffs. And the plural of staff is staves. So we now have 2 staves. One is a high staff, and the bottom one is a low staff. And the letters D and G morphed into what we now use as the treble clef, or the G clef. And the bass clef came out of the letter F, and is really a stylized calligraphy version of the letter F. And so now if you attach those 2 with a line, we can use the treble clef and the bass clef together, and we call this the grand staff. And the grand staff is a very handy thing to use to notate music, because with this, there's 2 axes. Up and down is the actual note, the height of the note. A note that's written low in the bass clef is going to be lower than a note written high in the treble clef. And because you write it left to right, you can put almost any combination of notes you can think of on this and go across and then have it play. So, music fits into a gamut where one note can step up to the next one, which steps up to the next one, which steps up to the next one. And you have these progression of steps for the entire range of whatever instrument you have. This idea of steps in music is represented by the 5-line staff, where you have a line. If you have a note on that particular line, and if you go to the note that's a space above, that's 1 step higher. And if you go up to the next line, that's 1 step higher. At the beginning of this system, a staff, we have a symbol called a clef. There are various clefs that are used in music, but the main two are the treble clef and the bass clef. And once we put one of these clefs onto that staff, it defines these lines and spaces as particular notes that have particular names. There are various systems we use for the names of the notes, but the three main systems are solfege, which breaks this order of stepwise notes into note names called do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, and ti. There's another general system which breaks these note names down to numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then the third way is with specific note names that represent a specific pitch. And those names are A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, the first 7 letters of the alphabet. And that's what we're going to look at in the next lesson. So come on back. See you soon.